Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'm here to continue our conversation on Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We are still on chapter 3, and today I'll be basically reading page 104 and 105 and then having a brief conversation with you. Now, if you're not familiar with this series, I highly recommend you to look at my Paulo Freire playlist and then follow along as we read the book. Now, before I go into today's reading and discussion, please keep in mind that in this part of chapter 3, Freire is basically trying to teach us that in order to devise a teaching system which is not the banking system but is the problem-solving system, we first have to understand the general thematics within which a certain group of people exists. And what he is also asserting is that there are always larger discourses, which he calls thematics, that determine our place in any given society. So in this part of our discussion, he is further complicating his idea of the generative thematics. And the reason he calls them generative is because they perpetuate and build and create other thematics within thematics. There is a slight change in today's reading. Instead of just bringing the pages up and reading them, I have tried to render them in Doodly to make it a little more interesting. I hope it becomes a little more interesting, but let me know if it becomes too distracting. So here, as always, I'll read and then come back and talk to you about it. Chapter 3, page 103. Generative themes can be located in concentric circles, moving from the general to the particular. The broadest epochal unit, which includes a diversified range of units and subunits, continental, regional, national, and so forth, contains themes of a universal character. I consider the fundamental theme of our epoch to be that of domination, which implies its opposite, the theme of liberation as the objective to be achieved. It is this tormenting theme which gives our epoch the anthropological character mentioned earlier. In order to achieve humanization, which presupposes the elimination of dehumanizing oppression, it is absolutely necessary to surmount the limit situations in which people are reduced to things. Within the smaller circles, we find themes and limit situations characteristic of societies on the same continent or on different continents, which through these themes and limit situations share historical similarities. For example, underdevelopment, which cannot be understood apart from the relationship of dependency, represents a limit situation characteristic of societies of the Third World. The task implied by this limit situation is to overcome the contradictory relation of these object societies to the metropolitan societies. This task constitutes the untested feasibility for the Third World. Any given society within the broader epochal unit contains, in addition to the universal, continental, or historically similar themes, its own particular themes, its own limit situations. Within yet similar smaller circles, thematic diversifications can be found within the same society divided into areas and sub-areas, all of which are related to the societal whole. These constitute epochal subunits. For example, within the same national unit, one can find the contradiction of the coexistence of the non-contemporaneous. Within these subunits, national themes may or may not be perceived in their true significance. They may simply be felt, sometimes not even that. But the non-existence of themes within the subunits is absolutely impossible. The fact that individuals in a certain area do not perceive a generative theme or perceive it in a distorted way may only reveal a limit situation of oppression in which people are still submerged. In general, A dominated consciousness which has not yet perceived a limit situation in its totality apprehends only its epiphenomena and transfers to the latter the inhibiting force which is the property of the limit situation. This fact is of great importance for the investigation of generative themes. When people lack a critical understanding of their reality, apprehending it in fragments which they do not perceive as interacting constituent elements of the whole, they cannot truly know that reality. To truly know it, they would have to reverse their starting point. They would need to have a total vision of the context in order subsequently to separate and isolate its constituent elements, and by means of this analysis, achieve a clearer perception of the whole. Equally appropriate for the methodology of thematic investigation and for problem posing education is this effort to present significant dimensions of an individual's contextual reality, the analysis of which will make it possible for him to recognize the interaction of the various components. Meanwhile, the significant dimensions, which in their turn are constituted of parts in interaction, should be perceived as dimensions of total reality. In this way, a critical analysis of a significant existential dimension makes possible a new critical attitude towards the limit situations. The perception and comprehension of reality are rectified and acquire new depth. When carried out with the methodology of conscientia cau, the investigation of the generative theme contained in the minimum thematic universe, the generative themes in interaction, thus introduces or begins to introduce women and men to a critical form of thinking about their world. My apologies for reading such a long excerpt, but I thought I should get done with the reading and then briefly talk about it. Now, if you notice, most of the concepts that he's talking about in this excerpt are the ones that we already discussed in part 5 of chapter 3. So he's still dealing with the larger general thematics within which we exist, right? And I had mentioned earlier in a previous conversation that we can also read the term thematics as a discourse or as a larger ideology. I think the reason he's using the term thematics is because he doesn't just want to reduce it to class, right, or community. What he's trying to suggest in this section is that there are different levels of a generative thematics. They can be international, they can be global, they can be national, and they can be regional and very specific sub-thematics within a given culture. And that if we are going to create a pedagogy that does not rely on top-down model, we have to understand the general thematics in which we are working, but also the specific sub-thematics within which people exist. Right? Only then can we develop a mode of problem-posing education which actually knows the lived or living conditions of the people with whom we are working. And that's absolutely crucial in a kind of pedagogy which is trying to challenge what he calls the epochal thematics, that of domination, right, against which he's offering us the pedagogy of the oppressed, the pedagogy of liberation, because the fight, remember, is to make sure that humanization is possible to all of us, right? So that's really important to keep in mind as he discusses this. Then there is another point that he is making, which is about the understanding of a specific thematics. What he's arguing is that most of the time people who live in a given generative thematics may not be aware of it. They may only be aware of its effects. We are poor. Our lives are not good. We don't have food, right? Those are the things that we feel on the level of the body, the epiphenomena of a thematic at work, right? The question is that unless we understand what causes poverty, what causes insecurity, what causes general illness, what causes exploitation, we cannot then develop a mode of liberatory pedagogy. That is why what he's telling us is that these generative thematics, they are like concentric circles. The larger thematics, within that it enables smaller thematics, and then depending on the region, the people you're interacting with will have different kinds of sub-generative thematics that constitute human identities, but that cannot just be understood simply by focusing on the effects. And part of problem-posing education is to learn along with the people we are trying to teach as to what kind of thematics are they caught in, who is generating it, who is perpetuating it, and then how to develop collectively a method to dismantle that. So that is the project. Right. Now, towards the end of this segment that I read, he talks about the concepts of consciência de cão. Right now, I can't really pronounce it well in Portuguese, so correct me if I'm wrong. But I'll take a few moments to discuss briefly the concept of consciência de cão, because he's going to discuss it overall in this chapter as well, but I thought I should dwell on it a little more. So the concept of consciência de cão refers to learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions, and to take action against the oppressive elements of reality. Okay, so overall, what he's teaching us, what we are trying to learn and teach our students within any given thematic universe, is to develop consciência de cão. Right, which means to be aware of what is the kind of life in which we exist, who determines that mode of life, what is the power structure in it, and what kind of reflection and what kind of praxis can we mobilize to change it. So overall, we cannot develop an effective consciência de cão if given within chapter 3, we do not understand, first of all, we do not believe that there is always a thematics at play, and that if we cannot recognize it, the reason isn't that there is no generative thematics at play where we are, but that we may not be aware of it. Right? And how can we not be aware of it? Not necessarily because we are ignorant, but because we are caught so deeply within the determining aspects of the dominant general thematics that we see our own condition or our own life in it as predetermined and as natural. Right? But learning that there is a general thematics within which we exist and then sub-thematics within that is crucial to developing the kind of consciousness that is critical of the world, that learns how it works, how its mechanisms work, how power works, because only then can we develop a sort of consciousness that strives to change it. Now, this is not very far-fetched, this whole idea that he's discussing of the thematics at play and how, it is the same concept, on a broader scale than what we attribute to ideology or to discourse, because both of them overdetermine our perception of reality and our understanding of reality, right? Most of the times the Marxist will tell you that our understanding of the real is already ideological. If you come to it from Lacan, we already know that we cannot access the real because the only way to access is through the law of the Father, through the symbolic order. So he's playing with the same kind of complexity, but within the context of developing a mode of education that encourages us to first learn what our living conditions are, how are they created, what powers are at play, and when we know that, only then can me as a teacher or as a student develop a curriculum, a mode of teaching, a mode of learning that incorporates within it the dismantling project of the oppressive order. And this thematics and understanding of it is not just pertinent to where Freire is writing. Think about our own lives here in United States. There are so many things that we believe in uncritically because the over-determining neoliberal thematic generates, because it is generative, its own modes of thinking and living in the world, right? We believing absolutely that we need jobs to have health insurance, that health insurance is not a right but an entitlement, right? That there are hierarchies of work in the academy. There are some people who are tenure track, there are some people who are lecturers, and then we attribute their position in the academy to their failure, right? They may not be good enough. All of these things that we internalize are overdetermined by a system of exploitation that needs cheap labor, academic and other, right? So a revolutionary education and a problem-posing education then doesn't just teach us the world as it is, doesn't just teach us the general thematics within which we exist, but enables us to think critically about it, to learn how it is produced, and then to learn what are the possibilities of change. Remember, he goes to the third world because what he's also saying is that in this dominant process, an objectification is happening. The over-determining larger thematic of capitalism and other, it creates things of people. It objectifies them. And in the process of doing so, considering the division of labor in the world, people in the developing world, in the third world, increasingly find themselves at the receiving end of that thematics, right? Now, do they take it as fate? Do they take it as their lot in the world? Or can we sit with them and learn together that what's happening to them, the way their lives are, is not necessarily because they are not doing enough, or only that their regional government is forcing them, or national government, but rather there is a global economic order in which so many people in the world are reduced to lives of poverty, right? That is the revolutionary potential of what he's trying to teach us throughout the book, but in this chapter. So to sum up, in order to develop the problem-posing educational method, we first must learn that we all exist in a given thematic universe, that thematic universe has global, national, and international scales. Knowing where we are within it, and then where we are, what kind of sub-thematics are at play, and what are they generating in terms of human subjectivities, human ideas, human behavior, is the first step in developing, along with the people that we are trying to teach, a politics, a conscientia causa that enables us to think critically, to evaluate the system around us, and then aspire to and try to change it through revolutionary acts, through pedagogy, through praxis. That's all for today. It's pretty short, but I'll be back with the next installment of my conversation on pedagogy of the oppressed. As always, I'm pretty sure I've not covered everything, even in what I just read to you. So if you have any questions, please post them in the comments. If you like something, do let me know. It's always very encouraging. But if you would like me to add something else, whatever your views are on the same topic, please share them and I'll be happy to respond to them. Thank you so much. And as always, peace and love.